Dr. Lynch, thank you so much for joining us here on the Science of Psychotherapy podcast. It's so great to see you.
It's such a privilege to be here with you both.
Yeah, hello, Johanna. Richard here. Great to meet you at last. I've been looking at your stuff. It's so interesting. You've done masses of really great things, and you've done something that we love. Is you've taken this time, put it down into a book, which is out in hardback and an ebook, I think, but it's coming out in paperback, which actually makes things a bit accessible. So that'll come out in a while. We'll talk about all that. But perhaps you could just fill us in a little bit. We've said a few things about you already, but what's some of the salient elements that you want to tell about yourself, and just what brought you to put this book down, to write, take that time to write?
Well, yes, so I'm a GP or family doctor, and I've been working in the field for about 25 years. And I guess I've got tired of people being treated as fragmented parts. And I encountered that over and over in my clinical work. I followed a trail following my patients, really, who taught me around how much their lived experience, how much their life story, relationships, how they saw the world, and those sorts of things had influenced their health. And so began looking into that about 15 years ago, training in trauma, attachment, and grief and loss as well, as part of my kind of way of seeing that part of distress in our community. And then as I built my own little clinic, a transdisciplinary clinic that I ran for about 5 years, trying to serve the adult survivors of childhood trauma and neglect that I had in my community. And that was really a wonderful time. That clinic ran beautifully, and my patients really enjoyed the mixture of art therapy and music therapy and trauma-informed yoga and mental health nurse and psychologists, social workers. But I felt really on the edge of my profession. There wasn't really a funding model for that kind of clinic. And I was also worried that it really had started to offer what I now know as strength-based trauma-informed practice. But I had no framework to confirm I was on the right track. And so went back to uni to do a PhD to examine that. And so that's where the book's kind of core has come from. And why I decided to write it is because it was a big story. It couldn't just fit in a few journal papers. I was trying to frame a new way of thinking about knowing about people that was not confined to either the social sciences way of seeing or the biomedical way of seeing. And I needed the space to explain that to the community that might need it.
Now, coming from the perspective of a GP, it sounds like there was quite a big gaps to fill in for you. Can you just tell us about the shift between what you were trained in as a GP and where you are now, looking at the whole person?
Yeah, so I think a traditional GP really already was a whole person and probably trauma-informed in practice. And when I write about this, I say good quality general practice is trauma-informed because a good traditional GP would have taken into account the whole family setting and would have known the family well over time and got to know their patient well over time through multiple different types of interactions, whether it be a short consultation or a long one. They build a relationship over time. And one Swedish writer in this space calls GPs who do that work resilient relationists, because despite the system, we have stayed true to kind of the origins of our tradition of caring for the whole within their context. But there is a shift in how biomedicine values evidence that has taken over in recent years, so that only a form of evidence that's about being observed and repeatable kind of knowledge that's easy to measure is considered valid evidence. And so that's shifted practice towards more reductionist ways of seeing the person. And obviously we've seen that in the specializing of care as well in the wider sort of health community. So it's that kind of movement I'm trying to fight against or preserve, protect that way of seeing the person.
Yeah, because I remember, 30 years ago, 35 years ago, the physician that we had in the area where we were bringing up our kids, and where I was sort of spent a good part of my life, and he was a real family doctor, and we went round and first name terms and all those sorts of beautiful things, and then this evidence-based stuff start to the controlling nature of it. And he used to say, we'd go there and he'd sit there and he would say, well, just a minute, I've got to tick a bunch of boxes. And he would tick a bunch of boxes, and then he would go back to what we usually did, which was what he would stop and he would turn his seat and he would look at you, and that sort of interactive, interpersonal work. But it is this discussion. I was having it in a conference. I was actually in Bangladesh the other day, which was very interesting. She was talking about traditional medicine in India. But then she was saying the right things, which was, but we have to have evidence-based and blah, blah, blah. And I was fortunately the discussant at the end of it. And I said, we do have to remember that the evidence that we're seeking and the evidence that we're producing is evidence of what already exists. So we have to be mindful that we're not discounting what already exists. And beautifully, someone had done a breathing session on breathing. And I said, if we didn't have evidence for breathing, I doubt everyone would stop breathing. So this is something that you have been, how have you managed with that? What sort of reaction have you had from the industry that has been, have forced into it, but then of course new ones coming in who know nothing but it?
I've been given the opportunity to speak and teach medical students early on in their careers, but only in the sort of edge of the profession. There's a slow growing and openness to that in the current curriculum redesign at my University of Queensland. So that's kind of hopeful. They're using words like transdisciplinary and whole person in their curriculum design. And I think there's a shift in the profession at large where those who've been forced to do work that's really not what they signed up to do in terms of the meaningfulness of the connectedness to their community, wanting to shift towards ways of protecting this whole person approach. And so we're seeing a growing number of people joining the association I'm president of, the Australian Society for Psychological Medicine. That is a society of GPs who do complex whole person care. And they're coming from areas where GPs serve the vulnerable. And really, I see in some ways those patients teach us about the whole. They show us the patterns of what impacts a person. And so the GPs that work towards that or turn towards those groups of people end up with this complex skill set that we want to protect and care for.
Wonderful. So we're finding ways to move away from the dominant quantitative way of seeing things to a more qualitative way of seeing things.
Yes, would that be true? I would say it's more from my perspective, it's around making sure we value both. Because I think there is a shift, say, in the person-centered or patient-centered movement, which is towards social science values around relationship, participation, context, meaning, subjective experience.
Yep.
And those things are coming into public health policy, where we highly value patient-reported experiences and how they see their outcomes. But somewhere in the middle between the biomedical and the social science is where a transdisciplinary lens or a generalist lens sits. And that's this skill of noticing the details and caring about the numbers and the traditional evidence-based kind of world, at the same time as deeply caring about story, narrative, context, culture, and personal lived experience. And it's that skill that I think could get lost in the mixed, because these two kinds of knowledge are studied in different faculties. And so the people who sit in the middle can get slowly written out of the story, I think is the potential.
Yeah, so when we talk about transdisciplinary awareness and you're involved in a university, how much interdisciplinary conversations, connections are actually happening between departments?
That is quite difficult, in terms, and look, that's one of the things in the literature about transdisciplinary knowledge, that it automatically has a sitting on the border. It's never going to be a mainstream position. You're never going to really have something that major that champions you. And so if you develop transdisciplinary ideas, you have the risk that they won't be used because there's nobody championing you. But at the same time, people are very open. So, for example, I've been establishing a biomarker advisory team for my project because although it's very social science oriented, where we notice relationships and culture, context, and people's personal experience, we don't want to lose how the idea also connects to the body. And so those biomarker experts have come from diverse fields. You know, there's people studying technology and how we monitor the autonomic nervous system. There's people studying back pain and how sleep and exercise and stress levels change pain. There's people studying chronic pain and how relationships impact chronic pain. There's people studying cellular stress that are noticing patterns between different diseases, like all the mucosal diseases, so asthma and fatty liver and inflammatory processes in the bowel. So we're getting a lovely buy-in across the disciplines when we invite them, but it's really inviting them to a project that's separate from something major organized in the mainstream.
Right. Yes. We have a bit of an analogy or metaphor from the mechanical world of cars, of motor cars, where you can have the discipline of spark plugs, the discipline of carburetors, the discipline of pistons, but transdisciplinary would be actually what I would call the engine. And this is what is lost, because when we talk about differentiation, that's different than that initial, what you said, this separation of the elements. And it was beautiful when you were talking about all those fabulous looks at ways in which pain manifest and are experienced and are affected. And of course, the idea then is to bring all those in together to sit, because the client is sitting there with some sleep issues, some mucosal issues, some gut issues, and that's the secret I'm hearing. Are you able to? Is the intention with all those different studies, as you're saying, you're aware of them, again to differentiate them but bring them all together?
Yeah, so we've been exploring how language can accidentally worsen our separation, and how that maybe, I kind of joke in my book about the king's horses not being able to put Humpty Dumpty back together again because they all now speak different languages. And so the idea that ordinary phrase, an ordinary English phrase that I think, if we think about qualitative research, it's already had a multiple focus group over a couple of centuries to work out, we all know what we mean when we say a sense of safety. And so my thesis was really looking at the literature across disciplines to see if that concept was hidden inside other disciplines already. And I found it in funny places, like the actual phrase sense of safety was used in the built environment literature about how people feel safer in their homes if they have solidarity with their neighbors and if they have green spaces around them. And the term sense of danger was in the immunology literature about how a cell senses in the immune system that danger's coming and we need an immune response. And of course, we know it's in psychological safety and workplace kind of assessment of how people are more creative and work more in teams if they're feeling safe at work. And we know it's in the attachment ideas around how the quality of relationships between our intimate relationships make us feel brave enough to face the world and also somewhere to return to when we're terrified. And so on it went. And so there was that real sense of, actually, I think this might be a language that could help these disciplines all have the same goal and all be able to share the language with the patient. And that actually sense of safety is an ordinary goal of every human being. And so if we came as clinicians alongside that, then we would be with the patient, helping them do what they wanted to do anyway, which is to feel safer in the world. But it also has implications for how we see disorder. So things like smoking, for example, or other kinds of addictions that people are using to feel safe. So it has potential to shift our language and our way of seeing towards a more strength-based and trauma-informed. So we know that people actually do feel terrified and despairing, and that the opposite of that is sense of safety. And so we know where we want to go for them.
This aspect of language, I mean, I believe that the DSM was originally to provide some common language around mental disorders so that different researchers could speak the same language, because it seems that the different scientific disciplines have created their own dialects almost, within their silos. And so to be able to come back to a common language, I think is so important.
That meta language thing, isn't it?
Yeah,
Matt? And safety, that was the word, of course, that jumped out in the book with so many of the things, aspects in the chapters and the titles and the subheadings. But linguistics was my first degree, because I was actually an actor and I talked a lot, so I thought I'd figure it out. But we end up, we now do a little experiment sometimes in face-to-face workshops and things, where we use a very positive word and just say that very positive word a bunch of times, and then there's sort of a more negative word, and you talk about words and positive and negative and functional and dysfunctional words. And when we say the negative word, people talk about the pressure in the chest and closing up. And of course, this is all we know, the neuroscience behind it, the closing down of attention, the focusing on threat, so on and so forth. And then when we say the positive word, things open up, they lift, they rise. And literally, this is talking about changes in gene expression and changes in everything about the body, that what we do in seeking evidence, in seeking research, is we discount, we try and get rid of all those variables. And that's actually the problem with it, isn't it? The removal of the variables. Yeah.
Very much so. And I think GPs, we've suffered from the side effect of the kind of reduced way that evidence has been gathered, so that most of our patients wouldn't actually fit into the study cohorts because there's too many complex things going on. And so we see that some of that evidence is not applying. We can't actually even interpret it in a useful way for our patient, because they've got all the things that were meant they would have been excluded from a study. And so, yes, some way of helping us understand complexity and using pattern recognition is hidden inside this concept of sense of safety. And I talk a little bit about how, as GPs, we head towards a goal. So when we know a blood pressure, a normal blood pressure, and then we can look for anything that's not normal, it becomes something we can look for. So whether it's a little bit up or a little bit down or a lot up or a lot down doesn't really matter, because we know it's not where it's meant to be. And, the psychological medicine area has had a problem with not being able to define what normal is, in inverted commas.
Yes, this what makes someone a functional human being, in what context, and who says,
what well-being is. And so I thought, sense of safety has the potential to be an undisputed goal that we would all agree on for people. But it also enables us to then pick up really subtle things that are not okay. So it helps us with early intervention and prevention as well. Because we don't need it to have ended up in some kind of disorder description for us to have seen that something's the matter. So it really helps with pattern recognition at that early end.
Yes, and I mean, we often talk about disorders, classifying disorder as a distraction from this broader way of thinking, because it's like, oh, good, it's that, and then you can go for it and miss so many things. And I must admit, in our book, we use in the beginning chapter an interesting aspect with psychotherapists, where we use something that looks terribly psychological and attitudinal and characteristic, but then we find out that it actually has a biological relationship to it. So, we tried to give that image that it's both ways.
Yeah. And when I teach about this, I talk about spurious precision. Where
I love it.
You've developed you think you know what you've got in terms of ticking a few boxes with disorder, but you've missed everything else that might be important in that space. And that's such a problem, even with experienced clinicians, when they feel like they're not doing what they're meant to do with sort of disorder finding, which has become part of how we sort of almost train GPs, that they're not doing a good job if they haven't identified enough depression, sort of thing.
Right.
Yeah.
So in talking about GPs, so to reach a place of good practice where a lot of this, what you're talking about, becomes intuitive. What's required? Because my impression of GPs is that they're very busy, that they're under pressure to get, patients through, and probably not a lot of time to study all of this other stuff. So what's required for a GP to go from where they are to what you would consider excellent practice?
Well, I think to begin with, GPs already have a bit of a focus on safety. So from practical things like drug dosing to watching over a mother and child when we do a new baby check to check on how they're bonding. We're already doing some safety approaches, and sort of our patient safety is already fundamental to us. And my current research has been doing focus groups with GPs around the world, and they say beautiful things like offering safety, or this dance of safety I do with my patients, is really my main work. It's why I'm important to them when they're passing away, that my presence brings safety, because they've known me so well over the years. And so there's this sense that it's not too far away from the culture of general practice to be aiming towards patient safety. And the pieces that I'd love to increase their awareness of are the internal, what are called safe on the inside. So the way patients talk to themselves and critique themselves and view themselves, and their sense of how they make sense of their own meaning in the world, that kind of existential distress that some Norwegian GPs are researching is linked to multimorbidity. And then a little bit wider awareness of the kind of dynamics in families and the wider community that are, oppressing or distressing people in their own homes, and how much of that's sort of underpinning some of the things they think are ordinary, everyday presentations. So I think it's a widening of the view and a deepening of what they already do. And we do teach GPs focused psychological strategies through the Australian Society for Psychological Medicine. And what we're finding is a natural, some GPs saying, I finally, all these bits that I had, I can see a coherence. When I teach about sense of safety, they talk about how you're describing what I do, but I didn't have words to describe it. And so there's a piece of this that's around protecting something that is already there in some clinicians and enabling it to be taught to others.
Now, of course, this is extremely important when we consider that GPs are the primary gateway for people to be referred on to other mental health professionals, be it a psychiatrist, a psychologist, what have you. And so the keenness of awareness of what's going on in the psychological realm is terribly important. I don't know if there's been that emphasis up until recently.
Yeah, I think, look, overall, our training in mental health has come because of sheer exposure. So when I teach experienced GPs, I say, actually, you're one of the most skilled mental health clinicians in the community because you see so many people. And because you see so many well people, your capacity to pick when they're starting to become unwell is really good. And the other thing is that they're very skilled at not shaming their patients because we have to deal with some very disgusting things in our work. And so the skill of being able to not turn your face up in disgust at people's bodies is actually a skill that can be translated in not turning our faces towards people's own stories that they may feel ashamed about. And so harnessing those two skills, I think, is not too far away from the heart of the generalist, the heart of the family physician. But obviously, there's a subset of clinicians that we're talking to because some really want to stay with being just body doctors.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, one of the things that Matt and I have talked about quite often is our different early careers, and mine was in acting, as I've mentioned. And this was what we did. I think it was a great place for me to learn what I do now, is that you would get a script, and the words that people said, the order they put them in, the pauses they made, and in fact, some playwrights would actually write pause. So when you breathe is actually relevant to your thinking patterns. And we would create from those words a human being. So it's ipso facto reverse. And the words that they say and the words that they don't say. And, it was so interesting, Stephen Porges, when he was with his polyvagal theory, I mean, he noticed this safety aspect and actually gave the sort of the scanning mechanism, he called it neuroception. Without really having a particular detailed description of what it was, but that we actually scan the environment for safety, all the time. And those things that you're saying about the nature of the way the physician is engaging with you, well, there it is. That's the rapport that we talk about in psychotherapy, isn't it?
Yes, and I think, neuroception, the concept of neuroception and Stephen Porges' thinking around safety is certainly very central to the theory in my thesis, as is the work of Maslow, who wrote a long time before the disciplines existed, and he called human beings safety-seeking organisms. And a lot of his thinking has deeply influenced mine. But I would say, too, that process of neuroception, the rapport building, the embodied nature of a clinical consultation, where we're sensing each other's breathing, we're sensing little flickers of the eye and eyebrow raises and hand movements and uncomfortable squirmings and silences, all of those skills. When we talk to experienced GPs, they tell us about them, they teach them to us in the focus groups that we've been doing. And we're working on a combined patient survey that talks about how safe they feel, alongside a pattern recognition prompt for the clinician to teach clinicians the fine-tuning of this skill of noticing how safe the other person feels.
Which you're not doing terribly well while you're looking at a screen and ticking boxes.
That's right. Yeah. So it's there's a movement. In fact, there was an article in the Sydney Morning Herald just recently from one of the up-and-coming GPs, Isabel Hansen, talking about the GP drought. And she talked about the need for slow medicine, not fast medicine. She says it's as bad for us as fast food. And the idea that slowing down how we relate actually does better work long term.
Yes, and that, again, that's a bit of a cultural shift, I would imagine. So you're spending longer, you're having longer term relationships with the families that you're caring for, which I know some local practices here, and they've got 24 doctors, and you go in and pick a number, and you get a different person every time.
It takes your chances.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. So I guess it's trying to protect what existed before those kinds of clinics existed. And, I had the joy of being trained by some lovely, wise GPs who'd done their time and then still working into their 70s around me in the neighborhood I'm in. And, the way they were with people and way they interacted in their community and served the vulnerable in their community has definitely influenced my work. And it's partly that heritage that I want to keep hold of as we go into the next, decades. But there has been some real funding problems with long consultations in our community. So I've had to make the decision to really bring less than half of what I could bring into my home, because I've taken the decision to do long consultations. And we would see in the GP world that there's a lot of female earning less, because we're seen as the caring ones who want to care and would take an interest. And so people bring to us their longer, more detailed, complex situations, which take longer. And our Medicare funding is designed to reward shorter appointments and designed to reward fee for service. So any of the collaboration you might do with other disciplines, or time spent ringing and checking, or linking them to social services, is not paid for in the current system. There are moves, and I got interviewed just recently about public policy changes around how we care for the vulnerable. But it's still, an area that I think needs some theoretical backing for why we need it. And that's part of what my thesis was about.
Absolutely, because the best, clinicians are the ones that are doing it because it's a calling, not because it's just a utility to make money. So if it's your calling and you do want to spend the time, you do want to, be your very best and be available to your patients, then you're not going to fit into that really commercial model, are you?
No, and I've got a fundamental problem with us using other people's tax money to make a funding stream for profit. Mm-hmm. I think there's some issues with that funding model that are ethical as well. But from the point of view of GPs who want to do this wholehearted work, and in fact, Maslow talked about wholehearted attending taking much more energy than categorizing. And he called for a use of what he called love knowledge when we care for people. And so I think, we need to shift the language and the kind of policy conversations around this in order to protect what's quite a precious thing that could get written out of the story.
And of course, when we're talking interpersonally, Richard, you've got a beautiful understanding, a model of the cycles, the natural cycles in terms of time.
Yes, we use, and actually this is one of the things that Ernest Rossi, my mentor, sort of teased out, because his mentor, Milton Erickson, who was a very famous psychiatrist in America, would always do 80 to 90-minute sessions and find out, and eventually discovered work from Kleitman, Nathaniel Kleitman, a few others as well, who didn't want to talk to hypnotherapists, but of this basic rest activity cycle, which we saw in dreaming, and then we saw it during the day, and then we see it as an energy rise and energy flow, and that there's actually a healing pause. There's a pause of about 20 minutes every couple of hours, which relate to our eating practices, where we re-energize and actually have changes in gene expression, and this time taken is so important. And I just quickly add, sorry, I don't want to hog it, but I was lucky to spend some time with Patch Adams, the clown doctor, as he was called, of course, who never charged. He had great donors for doing things, but they also worked at places. But someone would have some kind of persistent, difficult illness, and perhaps even just something simple like a persistent cold or something, and he'd say, "Oh, great, I'll have a look at you. Come bring the family and stay with us for a week." And he would walk with them and talk with them, and so totally impractical in the modern economic world. But that sort of thing, I guess, was the old healers, the village healers, who would do that sort of form of time taken and integrative practice.
Yeah.
Yes, and I think that points to the professionalizing of knowledge, and the professionalizing of what I advisedly call the mental health industry, and the de-skilling of our wider community in how to have conversations that are supportive and kind to our neighbors. So I guess I saw the sense of safety model also offering a language that crosses that boundary. So it could be equally applicable to somebody offering someone a cup of tea as it could be to someone offering, hypnotherapy for childhood trauma. And that both is aiming for the same thing, which is that this person feels safer in the world where they are.
And it's one of the explanations or understandings of why so many different therapeutic interventions can have a positive effect. If they can produce a sense of safety, and we actually know from other work, and certainly work that Ernest Rossi and some of our group did, on gene expression, on the changes when you can relax, when you can feel centered, when you can feel more self-efficacious in the Bandura term, but also that area of Maslow of autonomous, that the gene expression would improve to anti-inflammatory processes and more stem cell processes. It's really, really fascinating that the whole body is interested in our health. And so healers need to be interested in the whole body.
Yeah. And look, even beautiful things like hope. There's a fantastic study done by Robert Ander, populations-based study, who he worked originally with Vincent Felitti, and he showed that how hopeless you are impacted your cardiac death rate, even when you had no cardiac symptoms at the beginning of his study, which was what the cohort he used. And the level of hopelessness impacted there was a dose effect. So, hope is something that people say they need for recovery, and yet we don't really measure it in our current ways of measuring outcomes in mental health. And same with feeling connected to other people and feeling that we have an active role in our own lives. Those things are what the people who've recovered from mental distress describe as things they need. And so, that idea, that sense of safety into the future is also a part of what we need to be well.
Yeah. I was just remembering when you're talking about, people just being loving and paying attention to other people. I've heard some disturbing commentaries about the society today, where if there's an injured person in the street, just how less likely people are now to assist. And it seems like that's quite becoming more pervasive in the Western world, and it's very, very disturbing. So we need not just for GPs and psychotherapists, we need a complete cultural shift towards caring for one another and creating safety for one another.
Yes, I often quote a saying that's attributed to Hippocrates that says that we're meant to cure sometimes, heal often, and console always.
That's great.
And I think, if we could just get the console bit better, the other stuff wouldn't matter so much if we did more of the consoling in every interaction.
Yeah, beautiful. Now, your book, The Whole Person Approach to Wellbeing, aimed for your cohort of GPs or anyone? Who are you talking to?
So it's actually aimed for all practitioners across the disciplines, including teachers. Because the concepts are designed to be able to be used across those. When I tested them in multidisciplinary groups, they said, we want this too, don't just keep it to the medicine. And so that was part of the thinking behind it. The other kind of key idea in it is that it embeds some Indigenous pedagogy and understanding of knowledge. Because we had 2 Indigenous academics as part of the stakeholders who were interviewed for my thesis, because I didn't want to write a book that was trauma-informed in Australia without the input of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And I also wanted us to acknowledge the wisdom that's in some of what I call the wisdom cultures, who still see the body as connected to community and country. And our own Australian Indigenous peoples, have held that knowledge for us for centuries. But I'd say also other cultures around the world, including the Hebrew wisdom culture, who existed before Greeks sort of divided us into body and mind. And yes. Descartes did more of that.
We love the Greeks a little bit.
Yes. Before they did that, we had a whole already. And one of my mentors from Norway talks about how it's not about bridging a divide between the body and the mind, or the person and the community. It's that we actually were never divided in the first place. It's just that we divided them to study and we forgot to put them back together.
Yes,
to treat and care.
Yeah, removing that imagined divide. And but I actually must admit, I found it very readable. And I was thinking of it in the different roles I have, and I found as a parent there was a lot of really interesting. And then I thought, actually, my kids could do with some of my older kids. I don't think it's for necessarily. I think you need to probably have up into the university type of level of reading. But I found it very readable on very broad levels. So that, I think, is a great congratulations to you, because that's hard to do, to make something that covers a lot of ground easy to read. But the ground you're covering is to talk about the human being, and we can all relate to it so easily, because we pretty much all are ones. except
most of us.
most of us. I don't know. I've seen my children sometimes.
Fantastic. Well, we'll put links in the show notes to your website, and people can find the book there as well. Any final words as we wrap up?
Oh, just thank you so much for listening, for asking questions, that for showing me that I know you're already working in that space, and that's why I approached you to talk through these things. And I'm just so thankful for the time and the wisdom that you both share with the world. Thank you.
Absolutely wonderful. Well, we appreciate what you've been doing in your work as well. So, Dr. Lynch, thank you so much for joining us here on The Science of Psychotherapy, and no doubt we'll be catching up again in the future.
Thank you.
Bye for now.